King stops his carriage in the middle of a devastating storm to save two orphaned children from certain death. The kingdom celebrates his mercy. Songs are written about his compassion. For 15 years, the rescued siblings live in the castle, as living proof that power can be used for good. But when the older sister discovers a collection of old documents hidden in the castle archives, she uncovers a truth so devastating it will shatter everything she believed about her rescue, her life, and the man she calls father. The numbers don't lie. 400 people died in just 6 days, all because of a single policy signed by the king himself. And her mother was one of them. The timing is too perfect to be coincidence. 3 days after signing the order that killed hundreds, the king went out into that storm and found exactly 2 children to save in the most public, most memorable way possible. Was their rescue an act of genuine compassion, or the most calculated political move in the kingdom's history? Now she must make an impossible choice: expose the truth and watch everything burn, or stay silent and become complicit in the very system that killed her mother. But there's something else in those archives, something that will force her to question everything she thought she knew about heroes, villains, and the unbearable weight of living with truth that no one else can see. What she decides will determine not just her fate, but the fate of thousands who don't even know. Their lives hang in the balance. The rain fell like iron nails against the cobblestones of Valdris, each drop hammering the ancient kingdom with a violence that felt almost personal. King Valerius pressed his gloved hand against the carriage window, his breath fogging the glass as lightning split the sky in two. He was 55 years old, and in all those decades, he had never seen a storm this hungry, this determined to devour everything beneath it. His fingers trembled against the cold surface, not from the chill, from something else, something that had been gnawing at his chest for 3 days now, ever since he had signed those documents in his private chamber, the ones his advisors assured him were necessary for the kingdom's prosperity, the ones that tripled the grain tax on the lower districts, the ones written in such careful legal language that the word starvation never appeared once, though that's exactly what they promised to deliver. "Your Majesty, we should return to the castle," his driver shouted over the roar of wind and water. "The roads are flooding." Valerius said nothing. He couldn't return, not yet. If he went back now, he would have to look at those documents again, sitting on his desk like a coiled snake. He would have to acknowledge what he had done. The carriage lurched forward, wheels struggling through mud that sucked at them like quicksand. That's when he saw them. 2 small figures huddled beneath the skeleton of a burned-out merchant stall, their bodies pressed so tightly together they looked like a single creature trying to make itself invisible. The older one, a girl, had wrapped herself around the smaller boy, her arms locked around him with such desperate strength that Valerius could see her knuckles had gone white even from this distance. They weren't crying anymore. They had moved past crying into that terrible silence that comes when the body has nothing left to give. "Stop," Valerius commanded, his voice cracking. The carriage jerked to a halt. Rain hammered the roof like 1,000 fists demanding entry. The king threw open the door before his driver could protest, stepping directly into a puddle that swallowed his expensive boots to the ankle. Cold water shocked through the leather, through his silk stockings, straight into his skin. He didn't care. He ran toward them, his royal cloak becoming a sail that the wind tried to rip from his shoulders. Up close, he could see they were even younger than he'd thought. The girl couldn't have been more than 8 years old. The boy was barely 4, maybe 5. Their clothes were so soaked and filthy it was impossible to tell what color they had once been. The girl's lips had turned a shade of blue that made Valerius's stomach twist. "Child," he said, kneeling in the mud beside them. His knees sank into filth that would take his servants hours to clean. "Child, look at me." The girl's eyes opened slowly, as if her eyelids weighed 100 pounds each. They were brown, he noticed, the kind of brown that reminded him of autumn forests, of his own daughter's eyes before the fever had taken her 12 years ago. His throat closed. "Are you an angel?" the girl whispered, her voice so quiet he almost missed it beneath the storm's fury. "Mama said angels come when people die. Is it time?" Something broke inside Valerius's chest. actually broke, like a bone snapping clean through. His hands shook as he reached for her, pulling both children against his body. The boy didn't even wake. His small head lolled against the king's shoulder, his breathing so shallow it barely moved his tiny ribs. "No," Valerius said, and he was horrified to realize he was weeping. Tears mixed with rain on his face, making it impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. "No, you're not dying. Not today. Not like this. Our mama did," the girl said, her voice carrying a terrible adult flatness that no child should ever possess. 3 days ago. She couldn't wake up anymore. She just kept sleeping, and her skin got so cold. There was no food. She said there was no food anywhere because the king took it all. The words hit Valerius like physical blows. 3 days ago. 3 days. The same day he had signed those documents. The same day he had lifted his quill, dipped it in ink, and casually sentenced hundreds of people to exactly this. To mothers who couldn't wake up. To children huddled under rotting wood, waiting to die in the rain. "What are your names?" he asked, his voice strangled. "Ilara," the girl said, "and this is Finn. He's my brother. I have to protect him. Mama made me promise." "You've done well," Valerius said, though the words felt like shards of glass in his mouth. "You've kept him alive. You've been so brave. But now I need you to let me help. Can you do that?" Ilara studied his face with eyes far too old for her years. She was evaluating him, he realized, deciding whether he was trustworthy. The weight of her gaze made him want to confess everything, to tell her that he was the reason her mother was dead, that his signature on parchment had killed her as surely as if he'd used a blade. "You're the king," she said finally. It wasn't a question. "I saw you once, in the parade. You were wearing gold." "Yes," he whispered. "Are you a good king?" The question hung in the air between them, more cutting than any blade. Valerius opened his mouth to answer, but no sound came. Out. What could he say? That he had just condemned her mother to death? That he was holding her now because his guilt was eating him alive from the inside out? "I'm trying to be," he said finally, hating how weak it sounded. Ilara nodded slowly, as if this answer satisfied some internal test he hadn't known he was taking. Her small body went limp against him, all the strength that had been holding her upright suddenly gone. She had made her decision. She was allowing herself to stop fighting, to let someone else carry the weight for just a moment. Valerius lifted them both, shocked by how light they were. They should not be this light. Children should have weight, should have substance. These felt like birds, hollow-boned and fragile. He carried them to his carriage, shouting orders to his driver that were lost in the thunder but understood anyway. The horses lurched forward, wheels spinning in mud before finding purchase. Inside the carriage, Valerius wrapped them in his own cloak, in blankets stored beneath the seats, in everything he could find. Ilara's eyes drifted closed. Finn hadn't opened his at all. The king pressed his fingers against the boy's neck, feeling for a pulse. There. Faint, but there. Still alive. Still salvageable. "Hold on," he whispered to them both, though neither could hear him anymore. "Just hold on." But as the carriage raced toward the castle, as lightning painted the world in shades of white and purple, Valerius made a decision. A calculation. He would save these two. He would make them his most public act of charity. He would parade them before the nobility, before the common folk, before everyone who might question his benevolence. 2 children, plucked from certain death by the merciful hand of their king. No one would ever need to know that his other hand, the one hidden behind his back, had signed their mother's death warrant. No one would ever connect the salvation of 2 with the condemnation of hundreds. He would be remembered as the king who stopped his carriage in a storm to save orphans. That's the story that would be told. That's the story that would erase all the others. Ilara stirred in her sleep, her small hand clutching at his sleeve. In her fever dreams, she smiled. Valerius looked away, unable to bear it. The castle physician's hands moved with practiced efficiency across Alara's forehead, checking for fever signs that had everyone in the royal chamber holding their breath. 3 days had passed since the storm, and the girl had finally opened her eyes for more than a few scattered moments. Finn remained unconscious in the bed beside hers, his chest rising and falling in rhythm so fragile it seemed a loud noise might shatter it entirely. "She'll survive," the physician announced, straightening his spine with a crack that echoed through the vaulted ceiling. "The boy, however, needs more time. His body gave up fighting days before you found them, Your Majesty. It's a miracle his heart kept beating." At all. Valerius stood at the window, his back to the room, watching the morning sun paint the kingdom in shades of gold that felt like a mockery. Below, in the lower districts, he knew there were other children just like Alara and Finn. Other families burying mothers and fathers who had fallen asleep from hunger dressed up as exhaustion. The tax collectors had already begun their rounds, extracting payment with mechanical precision from people who had nothing left to give. "Leave us," he said quietly. The physician bowed and retreated, his footsteps swallowed by thick carpets that cost more than most families earned in a year. The door clicked shut. Valerius remained frozen at the window, his reflection staring back at him like an accusation. "You're the king from the storm." Alara's voice was stronger now, though still carrying the rasp of someone who had screamed themselves hoarse. Valerius turned slowly, forcing his face into an expression he had perfected over decades of rule, benevolent concern with just enough warmth to seem genuine without being excessive. "I am," he said, moving toward her bed with measured steps. "How are you feeling?" "Hungry," she admitted, and there was something in the way she said it that made his chest constrict. Not the casual hunger of a child before dinner, but the deep gnawing acknowledgement of someone who had learned that hunger was simply a permanent state of existence. "Is Finn going to die?" "No," Valerius said firmly, surprised by how much he needed that to be true. "My physicians are the finest in 7 kingdoms. He'll wake up. He just needs rest." Alara nodded, her small fingers pulling at the silk sheets that covered her. She had been bathed, dressed in a clean nightgown that had once belonged to the king's own daughter, her hair brushed until it shone like polished chestnuts. The transformation from the mud-covered creature he'd found to this almost ethereal child was startling. "Why did you save us?" she asked suddenly, her brown eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him want to look away. The question was simple. The answer was a labyrinth. "Because it was the right thing to do," Valerius said, the lie tasting like copper on his tongue. "A king must protect his people, all of his people. Even the poor ones?" The words hung in the air between them like a blade suspended by a thread. Valerius felt sweat forming at the base of his spine despite the room's chill. There was something in the way she asked it, a note of skepticism that seemed impossibly mature for an 8-year-old girl who had nearly died 3 days ago. "Especially the poor ones," he said, and this time he almost believed himself. A knock at the door interrupted them. Chancellor Aldous entered without waiting for permission, his face carrying the practiced neutrality of a man who had served 3 kings and learned to survive them all. He held a stack of parchments that Valerius recognized immediately. The daily reports from the tax collectors, documenting their efficiency with numbers that represented human suffering compressed into neat columns. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but there are matters requiring your immediate attention," Aldous said, his eyes flickering briefly to Alara before returning to the king. "Perhaps we should discuss this in your private study." "No," Valerius said, the word coming out sharper than intended. "Whatever needs to be said can be said here." Aldous' eyebrow raised a fraction of an inch, the only sign of his surprise. He cleared his throat, glancing again at Alara, who was watching this exchange with the focused attention of a hawk tracking a mouse. "The lower districts are experiencing some unrest regarding the new grain taxation policies." Aldous began carefully, using the sanitized language of bureaucracy to describe what Valerius knew was actually desperation boiling into rage. "Several families have defaulted on payments. The collectors are requesting guidance on how to proceed with property seizures. Such clean words for throwing families into the streets. Tell them to wait, Valerius said, his voice hollow. Give the families 2 more weeks. Aldis's other eyebrow joined the first. Your Majesty, that sets a concerning precedent. If word spreads that deadlines are negotiable, we'll have mass defaults within a month. The Treasury cannot sustain such losses. The Treasury, Valerius repeated slowly, is, filled with gold we extracted from people who are eating grass to survive. I think it can sustain 2 weeks of mercy. The word mercy landed between them like a stone dropped in still water, ripples spreading outward. Aldis's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly to catalog before settling back into professional neutrality. But Valerius had seen it, the flash of something that looked uncomfortably close to contempt. As you wish, Your Majesty, Aldis said, bowing with geometric precision before retreating from the room. Silence rushed back in to fill the space he'd left. Valerius turned to find Alara staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. Her small hands had stopped fidgeting with the sheets. She sat perfectly still, like a rabbit that had sensed a predator and frozen in hopes of invisibility. What's taxation? She asked quietly. It's how a kingdom pays for things it needs, Valerius explained, moving to sit in the chair beside her. Bed. The wood creaked under his weight, a small sound that seemed loud in the heavy air. Roads, soldiers, physicians, everything costs money. Is that why Mama couldn't buy food? Because she had to give her money to the kingdom? The question was innocent. The question was a dagger. Your mother, Valerius began, then stopped. What could he possibly say? That yes, his policies had drained her dry, that his signature on parchment had transformed her from a living woman into a corpse in 3 days? Your mother was a victim of unfortunate circumstances. Sometimes the world is cruel and good people suffer through no fault of their own. It was the kind of empty political answer he had given 1,000 times before. It meant nothing and everything. It was designed to sound compassionate while accepting no responsibility. Alara studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she did something that shocked him into stillness. She reached out and took his hand in both of hers. Her fingers were small and warm, and they gripped him with surprising strength. Thank you for saving us, she whispered. Even if you couldn't save Mama, thank you for not letting Finn die in the rain. Valerius felt something crack inside his chest again, the same breaking sensation from the storm. Her gratitude was worse than her skepticism. Her trust was a weight that crushed him more thoroughly than any accusation could have. You're welcome, he managed, the words scraping their way out of his throat. She smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed her entire face, and Valerius understood with horrifying clarity what he had done. He hadn't just saved 2 children. He had created 2 living, breathing pieces of evidence that would testify to his benevolence for the rest of their lives. Every time someone saw them, healthy and educated and cared for in the castle, they would think, there is a good king. There is a man who stops for orphans in storms. No one would think about the policies. No one would add up the numbers. No one would connect his salvation of 2 with his condemnation of hundreds. He had bought himself redemption with their lives, and they would never know the price. Rest now, he said gently, extracting his hand from hers with care. When Finn wakes up, we'll make sure you both have everything you need. As he left the chamber, he heard her settle back into the pillows with a contented sigh. The sound followed him down the corridor like a ghost, like the echo of his daughter's voice from 12 years ago, like every decision he had ever made that seemed right in the moment and rotted into something unrecognizable later. Chancellor Aldis waited at the end of the hall, his face carefully blank. That was quite a performance, Your Majesty, he said quietly. Valerius stopped walking. What do you mean? The whole kingdom will hear about this by nightfall. The king who saved orphans. The king who showed mercy to tax defaulters. Your approval ratings will soar. Aldis paused, letting the words sink in. It's almost as if you planned it. Their eyes met. In that moment, Valerius saw his chancellor understood everything, had perhaps understood from the very beginning. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt almost like relief. "Make sure the story spreads properly," Valerius said. "I want every tavern, every market, every church talking about those children by week's end." "Already arranged, Your Majesty." Valerius nodded and continued walking, leaving Aldous behind. As he descended the stairs toward his private chambers, he could hear Ilara's voice in his memory. "Are you a good king?" He still didn't have an answer, but now he had a story everyone would believe. 15 years crawled by like wounded animals, each one leaving scars that nobody talked about but everyone carried. Ilara stood before the mirror in her chamber, adjusting the emerald brooch that marked her as a ward of the crown, and barely recognized the woman staring back. 23 years old now, educated in 3 languages, trained in courtly manners and political strategy, dressed in silks that cost more than her mother had earned in a lifetime. The girl who had nearly died under that merchant's stall was gone. In her place stood someone who belonged in these marble halls, who knew which fork to use at state dinners, who could discuss trade agreements and military tactics with the kingdom's advisors without missing a beat. Someone who had learned to smile at the right moments and stay silent at the right times. Someone who had almost forgotten what hunger felt like. Almost. "Ilara, are you ready?" Finn's voice called from outside her door, followed by his characteristic knock. 3 quick raps that always made her think of a bird pecking at glass. "Father is waiting in the Great Hall. Apparently some duchess from the eastern provinces wants to meet us." Again, "Father." The word still felt strange even after 15 years of using it. King Valerius had never formally adopted them, but he had given them his name in every way that mattered. Finn called him father without hesitation, without the slight pause that still caught in Ilara's throat sometimes. She opened the door to find her brother leaning against the frame with that easy confidence that came from never doubting your place in the world. At 19, Finn had grown into someone who turned heads at court functions, with sharp features and, their mother's dark hair that he wore longer than was fashionable. He had no memory of the storm, no memory of their mother, no memory of hunger or fear or cold that seeped into your bones and never quite left. Sometimes Ilara envied him that mercy. Sometimes she resented it. "Another one?" she asked, stepping into the corridor where afternoon light streamed through stained glass windows, painting the floor in fragments of red and gold. "That's the 3rd noble this month who suddenly needs to express their admiration for the king's charitable heart." Finn shrugged, falling into step beside her. "Can you blame them? We're walking, talking proof that nobility still means something. That power can be used for good." He said it without irony, without questioning. He believed it the way he believed the sun would rise tomorrow. Ilara said nothing. Her silk slippers whispered against marble as they walked, a sound so different from the squelch of mud and filth she sometimes still heard in her nightmares. The castle had become home, its corridors as familiar as her own heartbeat. But there were moments when she felt like an actress who had been performing the same role for so long, she'd forgotten it was just a performance. The Great Hall opened before them like a cathedral of power, all soaring ceilings and tapestries depicting glorious battles that sanitized the blood into artistic abstraction. King Valerius stood at the center near the throne, his hair more silver than gold now, his frame still imposing despite the 7 decades weighing on his shoulders. The Duchess curtsied with practiced grace, but her eyes were already fixed on Ilara and Finn, with the kind of calculating warmth that came from seeing opportunity wrapped in sentiment. "Ah, here they are," Valerius announced, his voice carrying that practiced boom of authority that could fill any space. "My dear wards, come, let the Duchess see what 15 years of care and education can accomplish." There it was. That phrase that always made Ilara's skin prickle. What 15 years of care and education can accomplish. As if they were experiments. As if they were proof of concept. As if their entire existence served primarily to demonstrate something about the king rather than simply being allowed to exist for their own sake. But she smiled. Of course she smiled. She had perfected this smile over 15 years. this expression of grateful contentment that said, "Look how lucky I am," without words. She curtsied to the Duchess with the exact depth required for a woman of her rank, not an inch more or less. "Your Majesty's generosity is legendary," the Duchess said, her eyes flickering between the siblings with undisguised curiosity. "I was just telling His Majesty how the story of that fateful storm night has inspired charitable works throughout my province. 3 new orphanages in the last decade alone." "How wonderful," Ilara heard herself say, the words automatic as breathing. "The kingdom benefits when we all remember those less fortunate." The conversation continued in that vein for another 20 minutes, a dance of pleasantries and political positioning that Ilara could perform in her sleep. The Duchess wanted something, probably a favorable trade agreement or military support for some dispute with a neighboring province. The story of the rescued orphans was just the opening move, the way you greased wheels before asking them to turn. Finally, mercifully, the Duchess departed, with promises to correspond further. The moment the great hall doors closed behind her, Valerius's shoulders sagged slightly, dropping the performance the way one might shrug off a heavy cloak. "Well done," he said tiredly, moving toward a side chamber where wine waited on a silver tray. "She'll vote in favor of the northern expansion now. Sometimes I think you two are worth more to the kingdom's diplomacy than my entire council." He meant it as a compliment. Ilara felt it land like a slap. "I should return to my studies," she said carefully, keeping her voice neutral. "The trade minister wants me to review the Eastern contract proposals before the council meeting tomorrow." "Always so diligent," Valerius said, pouring wine into a crystal goblet that caught the light and scattered it like liquid rubies. "You've become invaluable to me, Ilara. I don't tell you that enough." "You've given me everything," she replied, the script so familiar she didn't need to think about it. "I owe you my life." She left before he could respond, her feet carrying her automatically toward the castle's archives rather than her chamber. She needed to be alone, needed to be somewhere that wasn't another stage for performing gratitude. The archives were blessedly empty, as they usually were this time of day. Ilara moved through rows of shelves stuffed with parchments and bound records, breathing in the smell of old paper and ink that reminded her of permanence, of things that couldn't be rewritten. Once the ink dried, she found herself in the section she'd discovered 3 months ago, quite by accident. Tax records, revenue reports, dry, boring administrative documents that most courtiers avoided like plague. But Ilara had always been curious about numbers, about the machinery that made kingdoms function beneath all the ceremony and silk. Her fingers traced along spines until she found what she was looking for: Royal Treasury records, year of the Great Storm. The leather binding was cracked with age, the pages inside yellowed but still legible. She'd read through this volume twice already, always stopping at the same page, always staring at the same entry. There it was, dated 3 days before the storm, a new taxation policy signed into law by King Valerius himself. The language was dense and bureaucratic, but she'd had 15 years of education in reading between lines of political text. What it actually meant was simple: triple the grain tax on the lower districts. Immediate enforcement. 3 days before the storm. 3 days before her mother stopped waking up. The first time she'd found this entry, 2 months ago, she'd convinced herself it was coincidence. Taxation policies changed all the time. Her mother's death could have been from any number of causes. Hunger was common in the lower districts even without new taxes. The second time, a month ago, she'd started doing calculations, cross-referencing death records from that period with the implementation date of the new taxes. The numbers told a story she didn't want to read. Now, holding the book with hands that had forgotten how to tremble, she forced herself to look at the signature at the bottom of the page. The flourishing script of a king who signed documents every day, probably without thinking twice about most of them. King Valerius in his own hand, the same hand that had pulled her from the mud, the same hand that had held her while she cried, the same hand that had given her everything. Ilara heard footsteps approaching and quickly slid the book back into its place. her heart hammering against her ribs like something trying to escape a cage. She turned to find Finn entering the archives with that easy smile that never seemed to leave his face. "There you are," he said. "I thought maybe you'd want to join me for dinner in the gardens. It's beautiful outside, and Cook made those honey cakes you pretend not to love." He looked so happy, so content, so completely unaware that their entire existence might be built on a foundation of calculated guilt. "I'll be there in a moment," Elara managed, her voice sounding distant even to her own ears. "Just finishing something." Finn nodded and left, whistling a tune that echoed off the stone walls. Elara waited until the sound faded completely before allowing herself to sink onto a wooden bench, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. 3 days. Her mother had died 3 days after Valerius signed that order. And 3 days after her mother died, Valerius had found them in the storm, had saved them with such public fanfare that the story was still being told 15 years later. The timing was too perfect, too convenient. Unless it wasn't convenience at all, unless it was design. Her stomach turned over slowly, like spoiled milk curdling. She thought of every banquet where she'd been paraded before nobles, every speech where Valerius had mentioned saving orphans from the storm. Every time someone had looked at her and Finn with that soft expression that said, "How wonderful, how generous, what a good king." They weren't charity. They were propaganda. And the worst part, the part that made her want to scream until her throat bled, was that she couldn't even be certain. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe she was connecting dots that didn't actually form a picture. Maybe her mother's death and the new taxes and the rescue were all just cruel coincidence, the kind of random tragedy that happened in kingdoms every day. But she didn't believe in coincidences anymore. 15 years in a castle had taught her that nothing in politics happened by accident. Elara stood on shaking legs and walked toward the door, leaving the archives behind. But the numbers stayed with her, burned into her mind like brands. 3 days, the signature, the timing, the story everyone believed. As she stepped into the garden where Finn waited with honey cakes and sunshine, she realized, with sick certainty, that she couldn't unknow what she'd learned. And knowing changed everything. The honey cakes tasted like ash in Elara's mouth, though Finn ate his with the unself-conscious pleasure of someone who had never questioned where sweetness came from or what it cost. The garden sprawled around them in careful disorder, roses cultivated to look wild while being meticulously maintained by a staff of 12 gardeners. Everything in the castle was like that, Elara realized, designed to appear natural while being completely controlled. "You're quiet," Finn observed, licking honey from his fingers with the kind of casualness that would have earned him a lecture from their etiquette tutor 5 years ago. He'd stopped caring about those rules once he turned 16, secure enough in his position to bend them without breaking. "The Duchess didn't upset you, did she? I thought she was actually less insufferable than most." "No, she was fine," Elara said, forcing herself to take another bite of cake that her throat didn't want to swallow. "Just tired. The trade proposals are more complex than I expected." It was a lie, but a believable one. She'd become excellent at lying, she realized with a jolt of nausea. 15 years of court life had taught her how to smile while thinking something entirely different, how to nod along with conversations while her mind wandered elsewhere, how to perform contentment so convincingly that even she sometimes believed it. "You work too hard," Finn said, stretching out on the grass with the kind of ease that made the gardeners wince. His formal jacket was already grass-stained at the elbows. "Father says you could take a position on the council tomorrow if you wanted. Why push yourself like this?" "Father." There was that word again, dropping from Finn's mouth like something precious and uncomplicated. Elara watched a bee navigate between flowers, its path seeming random but following patterns invisible to human eyes. Purposeful chaos. Controlled wilderness. "Because I want to earn it," she heard herself say, "not just be given it because of who saved us." Finn sat up, his expression shifting into something more serious. "Is that what you think? That everything we have is charity?" He shook his head. dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that made him look younger than 19. Ilara, we've worked for this. You especially. The hours you've spent studying, the languages you've mastered, the way you can walk into a room and read every political current like it's written on the walls. That's not charity. That's earned. He meant it. He actually believed every word. And why wouldn't he? Finn had been 4 years old during the storm, maybe 5. He had no memory of their mother's face, no recollection of hunger that turned your stomach into a clenched fist, no understanding that their rescue might have been anything other than miraculous benevolence. Ilara felt a sudden overwhelming urge to tell him everything, to drag him to the archives and show him the taxation records, the dates, the signature, the death reports, to make him see what she'd seen, to share this crushing weight that was making it hard to breathe. But looking at his face, open and trusting and happy, she couldn't do it. Finn loved Valerius the way a son loves a father. Truly loved him, without reservation or complication. What right did she have to destroy that? What proof did she actually have beyond suspicious timing and her own growing paranoia? You're right, she said instead, hating herself for the cowardice. I'm just overthinking things, as usual. Finn's smile returned, bright as sunlight on water. That's my sister, overthinking since 8 years old. He stood, brushing grass from his jacket in a half-hearted way that would definitely earn complaints from the laundry staff. Come on, there's a festival in the lower districts tonight. Father gave me permission to attend if we take guards. Real people. Real music. Real fun for once instead of another suffocating state dinner. The lower districts, where their mother had died, where people still struggled under taxes that had only grown heavier over 15 years, though the increases were always small enough, gradual enough, that nobody noticed until it was too late. Ilara hadn't been back since the storm, had avoided even thinking about those streets with an almost superstitious dread. I don't know, she began, but Finn was already pulling her to her feet. No excuses. You need to remember what the kingdom actually looks like outside these walls. Besides, people love seeing us. It makes them happy, knowing that Father cares enough to send his wards among them. His wards, his proof of concept, his living, breathing public relations campaign. Ilara followed her brother back into the castle, her mind churning. Maybe going to the lower districts would help. Maybe seeing the people, talking to them, understanding their lives would either confirm or dispel the terrible suspicions growing like poison ivy through her thoughts. Maybe she'd find evidence that things weren't as bad as the numbers suggested, that the taxation records she'd found were anomalies, that her mother's death really was just cruel luck and nothing more. Or maybe she'd find the opposite. 4 hours later, dressed in fine clothes that had been carefully selected to look humble while still marking them as nobility, Ilara and Finn walked through streets that smelled of roasting meat and unwashed bodies and something else underneath it all that Ilara couldn't quite identify. Desperation, maybe. The kind that had become so commonplace it was just part of the air. The festival was exactly as Finn had promised. Real music from real instruments, dancing that followed no courtly steps, laughter that sounded genuine because it was. Their 4 guards maintained a discreet distance, close enough to intervene if needed, but far enough to maintain the illusion of normalcy. People recognized them immediately. Of course they did. The story of the rescued orphans was part of the kingdom's mythology now, told and retold until it had taken on the weight of legend. Children pointed and whispered. Adults smiled and bowed, their expressions warm with the kind of reflected glory that comes from living in a kingdom ruled by a man generous enough to save orphans from storms. "My lady," an old woman said, approaching with the careful deference of someone who knew their place but wanted to be acknowledged anyway. "May I just say it's such a blessing to see you here. Gives us hope, it does, knowing that good things can happen even to the lowest of us." Ilara felt Finn squeeze her hand encouragingly. She managed a smile that felt like her face might crack from the effort. "The king's generosity extended to us," she said, the words automatic. "But we're no different from anyone else. We were just fortunate." Fortunate indeed, the woman agreed, her smile showing gaps where teeth had once been, though I suppose fortune favors those who deserve it. Your mother, God's rest her soul, must have been a good woman to raise such fine children. The mention of their mother hit Alara like a physical blow. You knew her? The old woman's expression shifted into something complicated, memory mixing with something that looked like guilt. Not well, my lady. But I knew of her. We lived in the same district before the storm year. She was a seamstress, wasn't she? Worked herself to bone and sinew trying to keep you children fed when the taxes came down hard. Alara's heart began hammering against her ribs. The taxes? Oh, terrible business that was. The woman continued, not noticing how Alara had gone completely still. The new grain taxes that year, they hit us like a boulder rolling downhill. Had to choose between eating and paying, and if you didn't pay, well, the collectors didn't take kindly to that. Your mother tried. Bless her, but when you're choosing between feeding your babies and keeping a roof over your heads, she trailed off, shaking her head. She wasn't the only one we lost that season. At least 24 from our district alone, all in the span of a few weeks after those taxes hit. Finn was saying something, probably thanking the woman for her kind words, but Alara couldn't hear him over the roaring in her ears. 24, from one district alone. And how many districts were there in the lower city? 15, 20? The mathematics were simple and devastating. If 24 died in one district, and there were roughly 18 districts in the lower city, that meant somewhere close to 400 people had died as a direct result of those taxation policies. 400 people whose deaths could be traced back to a single signature on a single document. Valerius's signature. The old woman moved away into the crowd, leaving Alara standing frozen while music and laughter swirled around her like water around a stone. Finn was pulling her toward a vendor selling spiced wine, talking about something she couldn't process, his voice reaching her ears as meaningless sound. 400 people. Her mother was one of 400, and Valerius had saved 2. The mathematics were elegant in their cruelty. Saved 2 very publicly, very dramatically, very memorably. Let 400 die quietly, in scattered districts, over weeks instead of all at once, so it never looked like a catastrophe. Just unfortunate individual tragedies that happened to unfortunate individual people. And then parade the 2 you saved as proof of your benevolence for the next 15 years. Alara, you're scaring me. Finn's voice finally penetrated the fog in her mind. He'd pulled her into a quieter side street, away from the festival noise. His face was creased with concern. What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. She had. She'd seen 400 ghosts. Her mother was just one face, in a crowd of the deliberately forgotten. I need to ask you something, she said, her voice sounding hollow even to her own ears. And I need you to really think about it before you answer. Do you ever wonder why Father saved us? Finn blinked, clearly not expecting that question. Because he's a good man? Because he couldn't leave children to die in a storm? But why us specifically? Alara pressed, her hands gripping his arms with intensity that made him wince. There were other orphans, other children dying. Why did he stop his carriage for us? I don't know, Alara. Fate? Luck? Does it matter? Finn's confusion was giving way to something that looked like fear. What are you trying to say? She opened her mouth to tell him everything. The taxation records, the death reports, the timeline, the mathematics of calculated redemption purchased with their lives as currency. But looking at his face, at the fear already creeping into his eyes just from these questions, she couldn't do it. Not here. Not now. Not until she was absolutely certain. Nothing, she said, releasing his arms and stepping back. I'm sorry, just one of those philosophical questions that hits you at weird times. Too much wine on an empty stomach. Finn didn't believe her. She could see it in his eyes. But he wanted to believe her, wanted everything to go back to normal, so he let himself be convinced. Let's go home, he said quietly. I think we've had enough festival for one night. They walked back to the castle in silence, their guards trailing behind like shadows. Above them, lights blazed in the castle windows, warm and inviting and completely oblivious to the cold, mathematical truth that Alara now carried like a stone in her chest. Valerius was waiting in the entrance hall when they returned, his face lighting up with genuine warmth at the sight of them. "How was the festival?" he asked, moving forward to embrace them both. "Did the people treat you well?" "They love us," Finn said, returning the embrace. "Just like always." Alara let herself be hugged, feeling the king's arms around her shoulders, and thought about 400 people who had loved ones too, who had children who mourned them, who died so that two could be saved in spectacular fashion. "I'm glad," Valerius said, his voice heavy with emotion that might have been genuine or might have been performance. After 15 years, Alara could no longer tell the difference. "You make me so proud, both of you." He pulled back, smiling at them with paternal affection, and Alara smiled back automatically. But behind her smile, behind her eyes, a question was forming that she knew would destroy everything once she found its answer. Sleep became a foreign country that Alara could no longer visit. 3 nights after the festival, she lay in her silk-sheeted bed staring at ceiling frescoes depicting angels ascending to heaven, and all she could see were the faces of 400 people she'd never met falling in the opposite direction. Her mother's face was among them, though Alara's memory of it had grown hazy over 15 years, reduced to impressions: warm hands, the smell of thread and fabric, a voice singing lullabies in a language Alara could no longer quite remember. The castle clock tower struck 3 times, each chime reverberating through stone walls thick enough to withstand siege warfare, but apparently useless against the siege happening inside Alara's skull. She threw off her covers and, dressed in the darkness, her hands finding clothes by muscle memory, a simple dress, soft shoes that wouldn't echo on marble floors, a shawl to ward off the pre-dawn chill that crept through even the wealthiest corridors. The archives called to her like a siren song, promising answers she wasn't sure she wanted but knew she needed. Her feet carried her through empty hallways where torches had burned down to embers, past guards who nodded respectfully at the king's ward, who was known for her odd hours and obsessive study habits. Nobody questioned her anymore. She had earned the right to her eccentricities. The archive door creaked open, loud enough in the silence to make her wince. Inside, moonlight filtered through high windows, turning rows of shelves into a maze of shadows and silver light. Alara lit a candle from the embers in the fireplace, watching the flame catch and grow, a small defiant brightness against the overwhelming dark. She'd memorized the location by now. 3rd row, 5th shelf, 18 books from the left. Royal Treasury records, year of the Great Storm. But tonight she didn't stop there. She pulled down the volumes from the years before and after, stacking them on a reading table that groaned under the sudden weight of governmental bureaucracy. If she was going to accuse a king of calculated murder disguised as mercy, she needed more than suspicious timing. She needed pattern. She needed proof that could withstand the scrutiny of her own desperate hope that she was wrong. The numbers stared back at her from pages yellowed with age, each entry a life reduced to financial notation. Alara's education had included accounting, taught by a withered man who insisted that kingdoms rose and fell on the accuracy of their ledgers. She'd found it boring then. Now those skills felt like the only weapons she possessed. Year before the storm, grain tax at 12% for lower districts, death records from malnutrition and related illnesses, approximately 60 across all districts, tragic but not catastrophic. The baseline rate of poverty claiming its tithe. Year of the storm, grain tax increased to 36%, a tripling implemented with 3 days' notice, death records from malnutrition and related illnesses. 417 across all districts, a 7-fold increase, a massacre hidden in incremental bureaucracy. Year after the storm, grain tax reduced to 20%, a merciful adjustment that King Valerius had announced personally, standing on the castle balcony with 2 recently rescued orphans at his side as living proof of his compassionate nature. Death records, 92. Higher than before the storm, but low enough to seem like improvement, like a king learning from mistakes and correcting course. Ilara's hands shook as she cross-referenced dates, as she traced the timeline that had shaped her entire existence without her knowledge. The taxation increase had been signed on the 15th day of the 6th month. Her mother had died on the 18th day of the 6th month. The storm had come on the 21st day of the 6th month. Valerius had found them on the 21st day of the 6th month. 6 days. In 6 days, a policy had been implemented, had killed her mother along with hundreds of others, and had provided the king with an opportunity for spectacular redemption that people were still talking about 15 years later. But was it intentional? That was the question that kept Ilara awake, that made her stomach churn with nausea that had nothing to do with physical illness. Had Valerius known the taxation policy would kill people? Had he anticipated the deaths? Had he gone out in that storm specifically looking for orphans to save? Or had he genuinely stumbled upon them by accident? She pulled another volume from the shelf, this one containing the king's official schedule and movements. Her hands left sweat marks on the leather binding as she flipped to the relevant dates. 15th day of the 6th month. King Valerius signed the taxation policy in his private study at approximately 2 hours past noon. According to notes in the margin, made by some meticulous secretary whose name was lost to time, the king had asked Chancellor Aldus 3 times if the increase was absolutely necessary. Aldus had assured him it was. The king had signed. 16th day of the 6th month. King Valerius attended a banquet celebrating some noble's birthday. According to the account, he seemed distracted, left early citing a headache. 17th day of the 6th month. The king canceled all appointments and remained in his private chambers. No explanation given. 18th day of the 6th month. The king emerged and resumed normal duties, though observers noted he seemed troubled and distant. 21st day of the 6th month. The king departed the castle at approximately 7 hours past noon, claiming he needed to inspect the lower districts personally. His advisors had apparently tried to dissuade him, citing the approaching storm. He'd insisted. He'd gone out specifically into that storm, and he'd found Ilara and Finn 3 hours later. Ilara's breath came in short, sharp gasps that fogged the air in front of her face. The pattern was there. Valerius had signed the policy, had spent 3 days in what looked like mounting guilt or anxiety, and had then gone deliberately into the lower districts during the worst storm in a decade. He'd known. Maybe not the specific details, maybe not the exact death toll, but he'd known the policy would hurt people. And he'd gone looking for a way to absolve himself. He'd gone hunting for redemption. And he'd found 2 children who would spend the next 15 years serving as his alibi. You couldn't sleep either. Ilara spun so fast her candle nearly fell, catching it at the last second before hot wax could spill across irreplaceable documents. King Valerius stood in the doorway, dressed in a simple nightshirt and robe, his silver hair loose around his shoulders in a way that made him look older and somehow more vulnerable than he ever appeared during the day. "I'm sorry," she stammered, her mind racing to construct an explanation that wouldn't reveal what she'd been researching. "I was just reviewing trade agreements. I know it's late, but I find I focus better when the castle is quiet." Valerius moved into the archive with the careful steps of a man whose joints ached from 7 decades of use. He glanced at the books spread across her table, and for a horrible moment Ilara thought he could read the titles from where he stood, thought he would see what she'd been studying and know immediately what she'd discovered. But he just smiled, a tired expression that held genuine affection. "You're so much like her, you know." "Like who?" Ilara asked, though her heart already knew the answer. "Your mother." Valerius pulled out a chair and sat with a heavy sigh, staring at the books without really seeing them. "I never told you this, but I met her once, years before the storm. She was delivering a dress she'd sewn for one of the court ladies. I remember thinking she had the saddest eyes I'd ever seen, like she was carrying some enormous weight that no one else could see." Ilara's throat closed. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He was talking about her mother as if he'd barely known her. as if their connection was a passing encounter and nothing more, as if his policies hadn't killed her. She asked me, Valerius continued, his voice distant with memory, if being king was lonely. Such a strange question from a seamstress. I told her yes. I told her that power isolates you, that every decision you make affects thousands of lives you'll never meet, and that the weight of those invisible consequences can crush you if you let it. He fell silent, staring at his hands folded on the table, hands that had signed death warrants and saved children with equal facility. Do you regret it? Alara heard herself ask, the words escaping before she could stop them. The decisions you made that year, the year of the storm? Valerius looked up at her, and for a moment something flickered across his face that might have been pain or might have been fear. I regret many things, but I can't regret finding you and Finn. Even if everything else that year was darkness, you two were light. It was the perfect answer, the kind of response that acknowledged mistakes while framing them as necessary costs for a greater good, the kind of political rhetoric that Alara had been trained to recognize and deploy, and hearing it now, directed at her, wielded as both shield and weapon, she felt something inside her chest turn to ice. Why did you go out that night? She asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral. Into the storm. Your schedule says your advisors tried to stop you. For the first time since entering the archive, Valerius looked uncomfortable. His eyes slid away from hers, finding interest in the patterns of moonlight on stone floor. I needed air. I needed to see the kingdom with my own eyes, not filtered through reports and advisors. Sometimes a king forgets that numbers on parchment represent real people. And you found us. And I found you. He met her gaze again, his expression open and sincere in a way that made Alara want to scream. The greatest fortune of my reign. 2 lives saved when I'd been feeling powerless to save anyone. There it was, the admission hiding inside the praise. He'd been feeling powerless, because he'd done something that had taken power away, because he'd signed a document that had killed hundreds and spent 3 days drowning in the weight of it. And then he'd found his absolution crying in the rain. I should let you return to your studies, Valerius said, standing with a grunt of effort. He moved toward the door, then paused. Alara, if something is troubling you, you know you can tell me anything. You're not just my ward. You're my daughter in every way that matters. The words should have been comforting. Instead, they felt like chains wrapping around her chest, making it hard to breathe. Because she believed he meant them, and that made everything so much worse. I know, she said. Thank you for everything. He smiled and left, his footsteps fading down the corridor until silence rushed back in, like water filling a void. Alara stood alone in the archive, surrounded by evidence that couldn't quite prove what she knew in her bones to be true. She looked down at the open books, at the numbers and dates that told a story of calculated redemption, purchased with her life, and Finn's life, and 400 other lives that nobody remembered or mourned. The candle flame guttered in a draft she couldn't feel, casting shadows that danced across pages like ghosts trying to speak. And Alara realized with crystalline clarity that knowing the truth was one thing. Deciding what to do with it was something else entirely. Alara spent the next 4 days existing in 2 realities simultaneously. In one, she smiled through state dinners and reviewed trade agreements, and played the role of grateful ward with the precision of a master craftsman. In the other, she felt like she was drowning in air, suffocating on truth that nobody else could see, watching Valerius and Finn interact with the mounting horror of someone witnessing a slow-motion catastrophe that only she could predict. The breaking point came during breakfast on the 5th day, in the sun-drenched dining hall where crystal glasses caught light and threw rainbows across white tablecloths. Finn was laughing at something Valerius had said, some joke about the visiting ambassador's ridiculous hat. And the sound of his laughter was so pure, so uncomplicated, that Alara wanted to weep. Father was just telling me about the new orphanage project, Finn said, turning to Alara with enthusiasm brightening his features. They're building 3 new facilities in the lower districts, all funded by the royal treasury. Isn't that wonderful? Hundreds of children will have shelter and food because of his generosity. Valerius looked pleased but modest, the expression of a man who did good works not for recognition, but because it was right. It's the least I can do. Every child deserves a chance at a better life, regardless of the circumstances of their birth. The words hung in the air like smoke. Ilara felt something snap inside her chest, a tension that had been building for days, finally reaching its breaking point. Her fork clattered against her plate with a sound that made both men look at her in surprise. "Every child?" she heard herself ask, her voice sounding strange even to her own ears. "Or just the ones people can see? The ones whose rescue makes a good story?" The silence that followed was absolute. Even the servants hovering at the edges of the room seemed to freeze, sensing something dangerous unfolding but unable to look away. "Ilara, what are you talking about?" Finn asked, his smile fading into confusion. But Valerius's face had gone carefully blank in a way that told Ilara he knew exactly what she was talking about. His eyes met hers across the table, and for a moment she saw calculation happening behind them, saw him deciding how to respond to a threat he'd never anticipated. "I think your sister is tired," Valerius said smoothly, his voice carrying the gentle concern of a worried parent. "You've been working too hard lately, my dear. Perhaps you should rest today instead of attending the council meeting." "I'm not tired," Ilara said, her hands gripping the edge of the table hard enough that her knuckles went white. "I'm awake. Maybe for the first time in 15 years I'm actually seeing clearly." Finn was looking between them now, his confusion shading into alarm. "Ilara, you're scaring me." "What's wrong?" "Everything," she wanted to scream. "Everything is wrong and has been wrong since the moment Valerius pulled us from that storm. But I'm the only one who can see it because you were too young to remember, and he's too skilled at performing benevolence to let the mask slip." "Tell him," she said instead, her eyes locked on Valerius. "Tell him about the grain tax, the one you signed 15 years ago, the one that tripled overnight and killed 400 people in 6 days. The color drained from Valerius's face so quickly, he looked like he might faint. Finn's head swiveled toward the king, questions forming in his expression that he didn't yet know how to ask. "That's not fair," Valerius said quietly, each word carefully measured. "You don't understand the complexities of governance. Sometimes difficult decisions must be made for the greater good of the kingdom." 400 people, Ilara repeated, her voice rising despite her efforts to control it. 400 people died because you needed money for what? New tapestries? Another war? What could possibly justify that kind of suffering? "The kingdom was on the brink of collapse," Valerius said, his voice hardening with the authority of a man who had ruled for 5 decades. "We faced invasion from the northern territories. Without funds for military reinforcement, thousands more would have died. I made an impossible choice between bad options and worse ones." "And our mother?" The question came out raw, stripped of any political polish. Was she one of the bad options or one of the worse ones? Finn stood abruptly, his chair scraping against marble with a screech that made everyone wince. "Stop. Both of you, just stop." His hands were shaking, his face pale. "Ilara, what are you saying? That father knew our mother would die? That he killed her?" "I'm saying he signed a document that killed her and hundreds of others, then went out 3 days later and conveniently found us in a storm," Ilara said, the words tumbling out now like water through a broken dam. "I'm saying we've spent 15 years being paraded around as proof of his goodness while 400 families buried their dead with no one to remember them or care. I'm saying we're not charity, Finn. We're propaganda." "That's enough." Valerius's voice cracked like a whip, carrying command that had sent armies to war and nobles to their knees. He stood, his full height suddenly imposing in a way Ilara had forgotten it could be. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You found some records and constructed a narrative that fits your current emotional state. But you don't understand the full picture." "Then explain it to me," Ilara challenged, standing to face him across the table. "Explain how you signed that tax increase knowing it would hurt people. Explain why you went out in that storm specifically. Explain why you chose us. I didn't choose you, Valerius said, and for the first time since the conversation started, his voice broke with something that sounded genuine. I found you dying and I couldn't walk away. Yes, I'd signed that tax increase. Yes, I knew it would cause hardship. But I didn't anticipate the death toll. I didn't understand how close to the edge so many people were already living. And when I realized what I'd done, when the reports started coming in about families starving, I couldn't stay in the castle anymore. I had to see it. I had to witness the consequences of my decisions. How convenient that those consequences came with a redemption narrative attached, Elara said bitterly. It wasn't like that, Valerius insisted, moving around the table toward her. When I found you, I wasn't thinking about politics or public perception. I was thinking about my own daughter, the one I lost to fever 12 years before that. I was thinking that maybe, just maybe, I could save someone. That maybe every choice I made didn't have to result in death. But you did use us, Elara pressed, not allowing herself to be swayed by the emotion in his voice. You turned our rescue into a spectacle. You've been telling that story for 15 years to prove you're a good king while people are still struggling under taxes you keep raising incrementally so nobody notices. Because kingdoms require resources to function. Valerius shot back, his own anger finally surfacing. Because I have to balance compassion with pragmatism every single day. Because being a good king doesn't mean making everyone happy. It means making the choices that keep the most people alive even when those choices require sacrifice from some. And who decides who gets sacrificed? Elara demanded. You, from your castle, while eating honey cakes and sleeping in silk sheets? Yes, Valerius said simply, and the admission hung in the air like a blade. That's what being king means. That's the burden I carry. And yes, I saved you and your brother not just out of compassion, but out of desperate need to balance the scales in whatever small way I could. But I also raised you, educated you, loved you as my own. Does that count for nothing? Does 15 years of care get erased because the beginning was complicated? Finn had sunk back into his chair, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Seeing him like that, broken by the collision of truths he'd never had to consider, Elara felt her rage falter for the first time. I don't know, she admitted, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I don't know what counts for what anymore. All I know is that 400 people died, and we're the ones who got to live in a castle because our grief was more useful than theirs. So what do you want? Valerius asked, spreading his hands in a gesture of surrender. Do you want me to abdicate? To publicly confess to policies that killed people 15 years ago? To destroy the stability of the kingdom because you found some uncomfortable truths in old records? The question paralyzed her, because she didn't have an answer. She'd been so focused on uncovering the truth that she hadn't thought about what to do with it once she had it. Exposing Valerius would destroy him, would likely trigger political chaos, would definitely devastate Finn, but staying silent felt like betraying everyone who had died. Like accepting that some lives mattered more than others based on nothing but convenience and timing. I want you to admit it, she said finally. Not publicly, not to the kingdom, just to me. I want you to look me in the eye and admit that you used us, that our salvation was as much about your guilt as it was about our lives. I want you to stop pretending this was simple benevolence and acknowledge what it actually was. Valerius stared at her for a long moment, and she watched something shift in his expression. The political mask crumbled, revealing the tired old man underneath, who carried decades of impossible choices on shoulders that were starting to buckle under the weight. Yes, he said quietly. I used you. Not consciously at first, but I used you. Your survival gave meaning to all those deaths. It gave me something to point to when I looked in the mirror and saw a man who had killed hundreds of his own people. And over time, that usefulness became genuine love. But that doesn't erase where it started. You're right. You've always been right. And I'm sorry. The apology landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the silence. Elara felt tears burning in her eyes, but refused to let them fall. She'd gotten what she asked for, the truth, unvarnished and brutal. But having it didn't feel like victory. It felt like standing on ground that had suddenly revealed itself to be quicksand. "I can't do this right now," Finn said suddenly, standing on shaking legs. "I can't be in this room with both of you. I can't process this." He looked at Alara with an expression that mingled hurt and betrayal. "Did you have to do this? Did you have to tear everything apart? We were happy. Why couldn't you just let us be happy?" He left before she could answer, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with the finality of a door slamming shut. Ilara and Valerius stood on opposite sides of the table, the ruins of breakfast between them, neither knowing what to say next. "What happens now?" Valerius asked finally. Ilara looked at him, at this man who had saved her and used her and loved her and destroyed everything she thought she knew about her. Life, and realized she had no idea how to answer that question. 3 days of silence stretched through the castle like a wound that refused to close. Finn avoided Ilara completely, taking his meals in his chambers and leaving rooms the moment she entered them. The hurt in his eyes the few times their paths crossed felt like a physical blow, like she'd taken something precious and shattered it deliberately, just to see what the pieces looked like. Valerius had retreated into official duties with the focused intensity of a man using work as armor against thoughts he didn't want to think. He attended every council meeting, reviewed every document, met with every advisor as if governing could somehow absolve him of the conversation that had split their family down the middle like lightning through a tree. Ilara spent those 3 days in a fog of her own making, wandering the castle like a ghost, haunting her own life. She'd wanted truth. She'd gotten it. And now she had absolutely no idea what to do with it. On the 4th morning, she found herself back in the archives without consciously deciding to go there. Her feet had carried her on autopilot while her mind churned through the same impossible questions on an endless loop. The taxation records sat exactly where she'd left them, waiting with the patience of inanimate objects that had all the time in the world. She pulled down a different volume this time, one she'd noticed but not examined closely before. Correspondence and petitions to the crown, year of the great storm. Maybe there was something here, some piece of context she'd missed that would make everything make sense. Or maybe she was just looking for permission to either forgive Valerius completely or condemn him absolutely, because this middle ground of complicated truth was slowly destroying her. The letters were organized by date, each one a small window into the kingdom's heart during that terrible year. Requests for tax relief, pleas for food, assistance, desperate messages from district leaders reporting illness and starvation, and responses from the royal treasury. Denied, denied, denied. Not enough funds available. Kingdom priorities must take precedence. Regrettably, we cannot accommodate this request at this time. Bureaucratic language hiding human suffering, just like Valerius had said, just like she'd been trained to use herself. Ilara was about to close the volume when a letter near the back caught her attention. The handwriting was shaky, barely legible, as if written by someone whose hands couldn't quite hold the quill steady. It was dated the 17th day of the 6th month, one day before her mother died. "To His Majesty King Valerius," it began. "I am writing as a desperate woman who has nowhere else to turn. My name is Meredith, and I am a seamstress in the lower districts. I met your Majesty once, many years ago, when I delivered a dress to the castle. You asked me if being king was lonely, and I have thought of that conversation many times since." Ilara's breath stopped in her chest. Meredith. Her mother's name was Meredith. She'd almost forgotten, the memory buried under 15 years of being someone else. "I have 2 children," the letter continued, the writing growing more erratic as it progressed. "A daughter of 8 years and a son of 4. The new grain tax has made it impossible to feed them and pay rent. I have sold everything I own. I have worked until my fingers bled and my eyes can barely focus. But it is not enough. It will never be enough." Ilara's hands shook so badly the parchment rustled like leaves in wind. Her mother had written to the king, had reached out directly, personally, desperately, had reminded him of their one brief encounter, as if that small moment of human connection might be enough to move him to mercy. "I am not writing to ask you to change the tax," her mother wrote. "I understand that kings must make decisions that serve the greater good, even when those decisions cause pain to individuals. But I am asking you to please find a way to help the children who will be left behind when people like me can no longer survive. If I die, my daughter will try to care for her brother. She is so young, but she is strong. Stronger than I ever was. But she shouldn't have to be." The words blurred as tears filled Ilara's eyes. Her mother had known she was dying, had written this letter knowing it was already too late for her, but hoping. Maybe, somehow, the king would care enough about two children she'd never met to do something. "Your Majesty once told me that power isolates you," the letter concluded, "that the weight of invisible consequences can crush you if you let it. I hope you will let yourself feel the weight of this consequence. I hope you will remember that every number in your ledgers represents a person with a name and a story, and people who will mourn them. I hope you will be the kind of king who stops to help, even when no one is watching. Respectfully, Meredith." Below the signature was a note in different handwriting, official and impersonal. "Received 17th day, 6th month, filed for review, no response required." No response required. 3 words that meant her mother's final desperate plea had been shuffled into an archive and forgotten by everyone except the woman who wrote it and the children she'd tried to protect. Ilara pressed her hand against her mouth to stifle the sound, trying to escape. Something between a sob and a scream. Her mother had asked Valerius to help, had practically prophesied what would happen, and he'd gone out in that storm 4 days later and found exactly what she'd described. A daughter trying to care for her brother, strong but not strong enough, about to die in the rain. Had he read this letter? Had it reached him before he went out that night? Or had it been buried in paperwork? Just another petition that got filed and forgotten while the woman who wrote it stopped breathing? I wondered if you'd find that eventually. Ilara spun to find Chancellor Aldous standing in the archive entrance, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He moved into the room with the careful steps of someone approaching a wounded animal that might bolt or attack without warning. "You knew about this letter?" Ilara asked, her voice raw. "I processed it myself," Aldous admitted. "I was the one who wrote that note at the bottom. No response required. At the time, we were receiving hundreds of similar letters. There was no way to respond to them all, no way to help everyone. We had to prioritize, to make impossible choices about who mattered enough to save." "Did he see it?" Ilara demanded. "Did Valerius read my mother's letter?" Aldous was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant with memory. "Yes. I brought it to him the morning of the 18th day, along with 50 other letters just like it. He read them all, every single one. He spent 6 hours in his study doing nothing but reading about people dying because of a decision he'd made 3 days earlier. And then he locked himself in his chambers for the rest of the day. The 18th day, the day the schedule noted Valerius seemed troubled and distant. The day after her mother wrote her letter. The day before her mother died. He knew," Ilara whispered. "He read her letter asking him to help her children, and then he went out and found us specifically. He went out looking for absolution," Aldous corrected quietly. "Your mother's letter affected him more deeply than any of the others because he remembered her. Remembered that conversation about loneliness and power. When he found you, I believe he genuinely thought it was fate, giving him a chance to honor her final request. A chance to do the one thing she'd asked, help the children left behind. Or a chance to use those children as proof that he'd done something good," Ilara said bitterly. "A chance to turn a tragedy into a triumph." "Both can be true," Aldous said, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who had spent decades navigating the space between idealism and pragmatism. "Human motivations are rarely pure. Valerius saved you out of guilt and genuine compassion. He used your story for political gain and truly came to love you as a father. These things coexist. The question is whether you can live with that complexity or whether you need everything to be absolutely good or absolutely evil. Ilara looked down at her mother's letter, at the shaky handwriting that revealed exhaustion and determination in equal measure. What would you do if you were me? Aldous moved to stand beside her, looking down at the letter with an expression that might have been regret. I would ask myself what outcome serves the most good. Exposing Valerius would destroy him, destabilize the kingdom, and accomplish what exactly? Your mother's death wouldn't be reversed. The 400 others wouldn't be brought back to life. You'd have the satisfaction of justice, but justice doesn't feed hungry children or prevent future tragedies. So I should just accept it? Pretend none of this matters? I didn't say that, Aldous replied. I said you need to decide what outcome you want. If it's punishment, you have the evidence to destroy a king. If it's change, you have the position and knowledge to influence policy from the inside. If it's peace, you have to find a way to reconcile what you know with how you move forward. But you can't have all three. You have to choose. He left her alone with that impossible choice, his footsteps fading into silence. Ilara stood in the archive surrounded by evidence of suffering compressed into bureaucratic notation, holding her mother's final words, and felt the full weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders. She could expose Valerius, could bring these records to the council, to the nobles, to the people, could watch everything burn with the righteous satisfaction of truth revealed. But Finn would never forgive her. The kingdom would descend into chaos, and hundreds more might die in the turmoil that followed. She could stay silent, could bury these records back in their shelves and pretend she'd never found them, could return to playing the grateful ward while knowing everything was built on a foundation of calculated guilt. But she'd have to live with that knowledge eating her alive from the inside, would have to smile at state. Dinners while tasting ash. Or she could try something else. Something her mother had asked for in that letter. Help the children left behind. Use her position, her education, her access to power to change the systems that made tragedies like her mother's death possible in the first place. Not as absolution for Valerius, but as honor to the woman who had worked herself to death trying to keep her children alive. Ilara carefully folded her mother's letter and slipped it into her dress pocket, feeling the weight of it against her heart. Then she gathered all the taxation records, all the death reports, all the evidence of suffering and calculated redemption, and carried them out of the archives. She knew what she had to do. She just had to find the courage to do it, and she had to do it before the decision destroyed what little family she had left. Ilara found Finn in the castle's eastern tower, the place he'd always retreated to as a child when the world felt too large and complicated. He sat on the window ledge with his legs dangling over a drop that would kill him instantly if he fell, staring out at the kingdom spread below like a tapestry woven from thousands of lives he'd never really had to think about until 6 days ago. You're going to give the guards heart failure sitting like that, Ilara said softly, not moving closer in case sudden movement startled him. Maybe I don't care, Finn replied, his voice flat in a way that made her chest constrict. Maybe I'm tired of being careful, tired of being the perfect, grateful orphan who never questions anything. Ilara moved slowly to sit beside him, her own legs finding the ledge, the wind tugging at her dress with insistent fingers. Below them, the lower districts sprawled in organized chaos, smoke rising from cooking fires, people moving through streets like blood through veins, all of them living lives that went on regardless of what happened in castles. I'm sorry, she said, the words inadequate, but necessary. I shouldn't have done it that way. Shouldn't have ambushed you at breakfast. I was angry and I wanted him to admit the truth, and I didn't think about how it would hurt you. You destroyed everything, Finn said quietly, still not looking at her. In 5 minutes, you took 15 years of certainty and turned it into lies. Do you know what that feels like? To discover that the foundation you built your entire life on was actually quicksand? Yes, Ilara said, and the word came, out raw with shared pain. I know exactly what that feels like. I've been drowning in it for weeks. Finn finally turned to face her, and she saw that his eyes were red from crying. his face carrying the kind of exhaustion that came from not sleeping because sleep meant confronting truths in dreams that were somehow worse than waking reality. Was any of it real? He asked. His love for us? The life we've had? Or was it all just performance? Just him trying to feel better about killing our mother? This was the question Ilara had been wrestling with since finding her mother's letter, the impossible knot she couldn't untangle no matter how many hours she spent trying. I think it was both. I think he saved us out of guilt and the salvation became genuine. I think he used us politically and still loved us truly. People aren't simple, Finn. They're contradictions that somehow manage to exist simultaneously. I don't want contradictions, Finn said, his voice breaking. I want certainty. I want to know whether to hate him or love him, and you've made it impossible to do either completely. I know, Ilara whispered. I'm sorry. They sat in silence for a long moment, wind whipping around the tower, the kingdom stretching out below them in all its complicated beauty and ugliness. Finally, Finn spoke again, his voice barely audible above the wind. What are you going to do? Are you going to expose him? Destroy him publicly? Ilara pulled her mother's letter from her pocket, the parchment worn soft from being unfolded and refolded dozens of times over the past day. She handed it to Finn, watching his face as he read their mother's final words, seeing tears track down his cheeks as he reached the part where she wrote about her strong daughter and the brother she would try to protect. She knew, Finn said when he finished, his voice thick with grief for a woman he couldn't remember. She knew she was dying, and she still tried to save us. And in a twisted way, she did, Ilara said. Not how she intended, but Valerius read this letter. It's why he went out that night. Why he found us specifically. Her words reached him even if her plea for help came too late. Finn stared at the letter like it might contain answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. So what now? We can't pretend we don't know. But exposing him would hurt thousands of people who depend on stable governance. It would make Mother's death meaningless if it just causes more chaos and suffering. I'm not going to expose him, Ilara said, and saying it out loud felt like both surrender and liberation. But I'm not going to stay silent either. I'm going to use everything he gave me, all this education and position and access to power, and I'm going to change the systems that allowed 400 people to die while bureaucrats wrote no response required on their pleas for help. She turned to face her brother fully, taking his hands in hers. I'm going to propose new policies to the council. Tax reforms that can't be tripled overnight. Emergency relief funds that activate automatically when death rates spike. Oversight committees that include people from the districts being governed, not just nobles who've never experienced hunger. I'm going to make sure that what happened to our mother can't happen to someone else's mother as easily. And Valerius? Finn asked. What about him? He gets to live with what he did, Ilara said simply. No public confession. No dramatic exposure. But he also doesn't get absolution. He has to carry the weight of knowing that we know, that we've chosen not to destroy him not because he deserves mercy, but because destroying him would hurt too many innocent people. And he has to watch us use the position he gave us to dismantle the systems that benefited him while killing others. Finn's expression shifted through several emotions before settling into something that looked like reluctant acceptance. You've really thought this through. I've thought about nothing else for days, Ilara admitted. I wanted revenge. I wanted justice. I wanted him to suffer the way we suffered, the way our mother suffered. But revenge doesn't feed hungry children. Justice doesn't prevent future tragedies, and making him suffer doesn't bring back the dead. So we just forgive him? Finn's voice carried disbelief. No, Ilara said firmly. We don't forgive him. We acknowledge the complexity of what he did and what he became. And we choose to move forward in a way that honors our mother's memory more than his guilt ever could. We become the kind of people who would make her proud, regardless of who saved us or why. Finn was quiet for a long time, processing this, his fingers playing with the edges of their mother's letter. Finally he spoke, his voice steadier than it had been since this conversation started. I still love him, he said, and it sounded like a confession. Even knowing what he did, even understanding. How we were used. I still love him, and I hate myself for it. That's okay, Ilara said, squeezing his hands. Love isn't a switch you can turn off just because you learn something terrible. It's messy and complicated, and sometimes it coexists with anger and hurt and disappointment. You're allowed to feel all of it. Do you? Finn asked. Love him still? Ilara considered the question honestly, searching her heart for an answer that felt true rather than convenient. I don't know. Maybe. In, the way you love someone who shaped you profoundly, even if that shaping was based on something broken. He gave us a life our mother couldn't. He educated us, cared for us, gave us opportunities that would have been impossible otherwise. That matters, even if the foundation was compromised. They sat together as the sun began to set, painting the kingdom in shades of gold and purple, casting long shadows that stretched from the castle to the lower districts like dark fingers reaching across the divide between privilege and poverty. Somewhere down there, in those winding streets, there were children like they had been, struggling against circumstances they couldn't control, waiting for someone to care enough to change the systems crushing them. When do we start? Finn asked finally. Tomorrow, Ilara said. I've already drafted proposals. I was going to present them alone, but if you're with me, if we stand together, it will carry more weight. The king's wards advocating for the people. He once saved, calling for reforms that protect the vulnerable. It's a narrative he can't fight without revealing why we're really doing it. Clever, Finn said, a ghost of his old smile touching his lips. Using his own story against him. Mother would have appreciated the irony. They helped each other back from the ledge, solid stone beneath their feet, feeling more reliable than it had any right to after everything that had shifted. As they walked back through the castle corridors, they passed Valerius's private study. The door was partially open, and through it they could see him sitting at his desk, head in his hands, looking older than his 70 years. He must have sensed them because he looked up, his eyes finding theirs. For a moment, the three of them existed in a tableau of complicated truth. A king who had killed and saved with equal facility, two children whose lives were built on the graves of hundreds, all of them trapped in a situation where there were no simple answers or clean resolutions. Tomorrow, Valerius said quietly, when you present your proposals to the council, I will vote in favor of every single one. Not because you're forcing me to, not because I'm trying to buy forgiveness, but because they're the right policies and I should have implemented them 15 years ago. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't redemption. It was just an old man acknowledging that the children he'd saved had grown into people who saw more clearly than he ever had, and that maybe, just maybe, some good could come from the complicated mess of guilt and love and calculated mercy that had brought them all to this moment. Ilara nodded once, not trusting herself to speak. Finn squeezed her hand. Together, they continued down the corridor, leaving Valerius alone with his ghosts. That night, Ilara returned to the archives one last time. She placed her mother's letter in a special folder, separate from the taxation records and death reports. Then she wrote her own letter, addressed to no one and everyone, documenting what she'd learned and the choice she'd made. Not for exposure, for history. So that someday, when she was gone and this had all passed into memory, someone might find it and understand that truth and justice were sometimes different things, and that choosing one over the other didn't make you right or wrong, just human. She sealed the letter and placed it with the others, adding her story to the archive of complicated choices that kingdoms were built upon. Then she left, closing the door on the past while carrying it forward into whatever future she and Finn would build. Outside, dawn was breaking over the kingdom, painting everything in shades of possibility. The lower districts stirred to life, people beginning another day of struggle and survival and small moments of joy stolen from hardship. Somewhere in those streets, children were waking up hungry, just like Ilara and Finn had once been. But tomorrow, when the council convened, when proposals were presented and reforms were debated, those children would have advocates they didn't know existed. They would have two people who remembered what hunger felt like, who carried the weight of 400 deaths they hadn't been able to prevent. working to make sure the systems that had failed their mother would fail fewer mothers in the future. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't justice. It wasn't revenge. It was just the messy, complicated work of trying to make something broken slightly less broken, one policy at a time, carrying the weight of truth while choosing to move forward anyway. And somehow, in the golden light of morning, that felt like enough. Some truths are too heavy to carry alone, yet too dangerous to share. Alara discovered that the man who saved her life was the same man whose signature condemned her mother to death, and she had to choose between justice that would destroy thousands and silence that would destroy her soul. She chose a third path, one that required her to live with the weight of knowing while working to ensure no other child would face the same impossible choice. But was it the right decision? Would you have made the same choice? Or would you have burned everything down in the name of truth? When love and betrayal occupy the same space in your heart, when gratitude and rage war for dominance in your mind, how do you move forward without losing yourself entirely? This story reminds us that people are rarely purely good or purely evil. We are contradictions, capable of both tremendous kindness and devastating cruelty, sometimes in the same breath. Valerius saved 2 children and used them as propaganda. He loved them genuinely while building his redemption on their grief. He was a villain and a father, a murderer and a savior, and somehow all of these truths existed simultaneously. The question isn't whether we can forgive such complexity, but whether we can acknowledge it honestly and still choose to move forward with purpose rather than paralysis. If this story made you feel something, if it made you question what you would do when faced with impossible choices, then please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who appreciates stories that challenge easy answers. Subscribe to this channel for more tales that explore the messy, complicated reality of human nature, where heroes have flaws and villains have reasons, and the truth is never quite as simple as we wish it could be. Leave a comment telling us what choice you would have made in Alara's place. Would you have exposed the king, stayed silent, or found your own third path? Your perspective matters, and we'd love to hear it.